All right, the 1950s. Here we go. 3 C's of the 1950s: conformity, consumerism, and containment of communism. So, one of the things that we know about the 50s is middle class America is growing, and there is an economic boom happening in that post war era. In 1950, you could buy a car for $1,700, but there was some inflation happening, and by the end of the decade, you would pay $2,200. So not a ton of inflation, but things are growing. The cost of housing went up, the cost of a loaf of bread went up, and salaries were increasing as well. We've already talked about this, the rise of suburbia mass movement of people, which was promoted by government loans, particularly to veterans in the form of the GI Bill. And most of these people were working class or middle class whites. And this later suburbia becomes to symbolize sort of domestic confinement of women, and women began to actually fight back. So while motherhood was embraced in the 1950s, people began to push back against that in later generations. So one out of every 4 homes built in the 1960s that existed was actually built in the 1950s. So 83% of those homes were in these new suburban centers. Here you can see the floor plans of some of those Levittown homes. And the nation moved from a nation of renters to a nation of homeowners. As a result of all of this, you have this cult of domesticity which develops. It is the belief and the myth, to a certain extent, that a woman's role in marriage was to maintain the home as a refuge for her husband, to train her children using Dr. Spock's manual, and to set a moral example for children to follow. Home was a separate and proper sphere for women, and they were thought of being sort of morally superior to and purer than men, and were best suited to child rearing. And so this continues, and this cult of domesticity continues in the 1950s, and it's really used for marketing purposes and advertising purposes. This idea of women being mothers, and that's the role that you should fill and have. And all sorts of things were marketed to these 50s housewives. There were even economics textbooks, home economics textbooks in the 1950s that taught you how to be a good wife. And in fact, all girls had to take home economics that taught you cooking and cleaning and sewing and how to really have a nice and make a nice home for a husband. You should have dinner ready, plan ahead, make sure that the home is warm and a welcome when men come home hungry. Prepare yourself. Rest up 15 minutes before he arrives. Touch up your makeup. Be fresh looking. Be a little gay and more interesting, because his boring day may need a lift. Clear away the clutter. Make one last trip through the main part of a home just to make sure that it's tidy before your husband arrives. Man, I sure would like a housewife. Let me tell you. Prepare your children. Wash their hands and faces if they're small, and comb their hair. Make sure they're clean. Don't greet him with complaints, and don't complain if he's late for dinner. Count on him. That is minor compared to what he might have gone through. Make the evening his. Never complain not that he doesn't take you out to dinner or entertains you. So the goal is to make the home a place of peace and order where your husband can renew himself in body and spirit. Let me just tell you, that's not what my marriage looks like. Within 15 years of the war, 50 million babies had been born. This is my parents' generation. That's one baby born every 7 seconds. But this peaks out in 1957 and then steadily starts to decline. In the 40s and 50s, you see this big marketing push towards baby products. And then in the 60s, it's clothing and rock music. In the 70s, it's jeans. In the 80s, it's job market competition. And in the 90s, it's raising a secondary boom of children. You also have new technology that comes out of this time period, and here you have it, folks, the modern computer. Yes, that says IBM up here in the corner. And in fact, computers in the 1950s took up entire rooms rather than your pocket. Communication devices that you kept in your pocket were things of science fiction. You would only see those used on shows like Star Trek. These are modern computers in the 1950s. You can see this is an entire mainframe computer. These are their basically disks. And They would process huge amounts of information, but it would take forever. You have your first passenger jets being used in the 1950s, so people can now travel across the oceans. There's a growing consumer culture. Over 7 million television sets were sold in 1951. You have stars that are popularizing and commercializing new standards of fashion and sexuality. Here you have Marilyn Monroe, Elvis Presley, and James Dean. In 1956, white-collar workers, service workers, outnumbered blue-collar factory workers. This is a transition from an industrial age to a post-industrial era, and it does open up some special opportunities for women. However, women were sort of forced out of factory jobs after the war. The men came home and wanted to return to the factories. Of the 40 million jobs created in the 3 decades after 1950, more than 30 million were clerical and service work, which were mostly filled by women. This sort of quiet revolution and women continuing to stay in the workforce would actually transform the character of the American family. And while we do have this cult of domesticity, sort of defining the American family, nuclear family as a mother, a father, and 2 kids, women working outside of the home started to push those norms even as early as the 50s. Not all was neat O'Keen, that's some slang from the 50s. There was some discontent. You had the Beat Generation and the Beat Poets. The Beat Generation was a group of post-World War II writers. The sort of central elements of their culture was the rejection of standards, innovations in style, the use of illegal drugs, experimenting with their sexuality, and an interest in examining religion and the human condition. The big authors of this time period were Jack Kerouac, writing On the Road, William S. Burroughs, writing The Naked Lunch, Allen Ginsberg and his poetry, and The Catcher in the Rye becomes sort of an anthem for disaffected youth. You also have civil rights reformers pushing at this time for desegregation in the South and all over the country. So here you have Jack Kerouac. I have nothing to offer anyone except my own confusion. Very popular writer. He's actually one of my favorite writers. You also have women that come out of the 50s who are questioning their role and start to write publicly about it. In the 1960s, you have Betty Friedan, who publishes The Feminine Mystique, which is sort of a classic in feminist literature and really kicks off the modern women's movement. It sort of indicated that there was a sense of boredom with suburban housewifery. And in fact, even popular songs in the 1960s talked about this. The Rolling Stones song Mother's Little Helper talks about this a little bit, so go listen to that one. In the 1950s, 15 million black citizens, 2/3 of them were all living in the South and were governed by Jim Crow laws, which was this array of social arrangements that kept blacks and whites separate from each other and kept blacks politically and economically powerless. So the things in the Jim Crow laws that were preventing blacks particularly from voting, which inhibited their political power, were things like poll taxes. You had to pay $5 to vote. Literacy tests, and the literacy tests were rather complicated and convoluted, and then the grandfather clause, which said that if your grandfather couldn't vote, and most of them, their grandfathers had been slaves, and so they couldn't vote, then you couldn't vote. 20% of all eligible Southern blacks were actually registered to vote, and in the deepest parts of the South, and that's the Gulf Coast states, only about 5% were registered to vote. And part of that is because of forced segregation and intimidation by the KKK, but segregation was absolutely the norm in the South. Whites only restrooms and water fountains were the norm. This is all based on a Supreme Court decision that goes all the way back to 1896 called Plessy versus Ferguson. And in that decision, the Supreme Court ruled that you could have separate but equal facilities as long as they were equal. Now, these 2 water fountains don't necessarily look equal to me. And later, a Supreme Court case called Brown versus the Board of Education actually overturns this case because those justices decided that separation was not inherently equal. There was no way by separating the races could you create equality. When laws proved insufficient to enforce these ideas, usually intimidation was used by the KKK. Lynchings were still very common in the South, and murder and intimidation, bricks being thrown through windows, etc. All right, so the KKK would use intimidation. Lynchings were common. And in fact, in 1946, 6 black World War II veterans were murdered when they tried to claim their rights that they had fought for overseas. President Truman's response was to secure these rights, which was a report recommending the end of segregation in the federal civil service and ordered equality of treatment in the armed forces. In 1955, Emmett Till, a black 14-year-old, was accused of leering and whistling at a white woman and was murdered. His parents chose to have an open casket, and his images were published in Jet magazine. Emmett Till's murder trial for Emmett Till, a jury of 12 white men found 2 men not guilty after deliberating for 67 minutes. Later in an interview with Look magazine, the 2 men actually described the murder in gory detail. So justice was absolutely not served as a result of this, which got the nation angry. In a book called The American Dilemma, Gunnar Mrydal exposed the contradiction of America's professed belief that all men are created equal and the actual treatment. The National Association of the Advancement of Colored People started to experience some success in overcoming segregation. The Supreme Court ruled in 1944 that the white primary was unconstitutional, meaning you could only vote in primaries if you were white. And in 1950, the Supreme Court ruled that separate professional schools failed to meet the test for equality. So people begin to start to get momentum and begin to protest. Rosa Parks refuses to give up her whites-only seat, gets her arrested, and sparks the Montgomery bus boycott, which then leads to the rise of Dr. Martin Luther King, a 27-year-old preacher who had formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to start advocating nonviolent protests and sit-ins. He used his power of the preacher and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to mobilize black churches on behalf of black rights. He is then arrested and thrown in the Birmingham jail, and this is where he writes a very powerful letter called Letter from a Birmingham Jail, and he says, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere."